Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's media briefing. I am Claudia Wessling, Director of Communications and Publications at Mercator Institute for China Studies. And I will guide you through this brief 1-hour session here. Before we get started, may I kindly ask you to switch off your microphones so that when we can avoid noises in the background. Thank you very much. So our topic today, we are going to talk about the 2 sessions that will kick off in Beijing this weekend. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, shorthand CPPCC, will begin on March 4th. And 1 day later, the 14th National People's Congress will open its first annual session. That sounds bureaucratic and boring, but it is not. China has just emerged from a very difficult phase with COVID restrictions being lifted, the economy being under pressure. So there's a lot to discuss at this National People's Congress. And also there's personnel changes ahead. At the NPC, Xi Jinping's close ally Li Keqiang will be elected to replace outgoing Premier Li Keqiang. And other formal state positions will be confirmed in line with the decisions made at last year's Party Congress. So the statements and decisions made at the Congress will provide information about the direction China will take in 2023. And in the next hour, our analysts will give you a bit of an insight on what to watch. So let me briefly introduce my colleagues. We have Nis Grünberg with us today. Nis is a lead analyst in MERICS research team for domestic politics and society. His research focuses on party-state governance, elite politics, and of course, the Communist Party of China. He also works on China's climate policies and green tech development. And we have Jacob Gunter here, senior analyst at MERICS economics program. Jacob covers China's political economy and industrial and innovation policy. He spent a decade living and working in China, among others, for the EU Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. So let me stress that this session here is on the record. Our experts would explicitly flag if they wanted one of their statements to be off the record. Proceedings. In the first, let's say, 25 minutes to half an hour, our experts will briefly present a couple of facts and assessments on the forthcoming events. And after that, there will be plenty of times for your questions and comments, which you can either ask orally or just write a question in the chat, but I will explain that again later. So that's it for introductions for now, and I would hand it over to my colleague Nis. Nis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia, and also welcome from my side. Nothing to get our Thursday morning juices started like a session on the NPC. The guesswork, I think the slides are different from different order from my slide deck here. Christine, could you go to the text slide first, please? Yes, thank you. So as always, covering the National People's Congress ahead of the actual convening is always a little bit a mix of guesswork and reciting what we know from past years. I think this year is a little bit special. We have to appreciate that it's a 5-year term is coming to conclusion. A new leadership team is in place in the party, and that is, of course, now being finalized in terms of the leadership reshuffle for the NPC in the state apparatus. So really 3 big themes, in my opinion, that we have to be prepared for: finalizing the leadership team that Xi Jinping is putting in place, normalizing party control even further. There is more room still, in case you wonder, and really stabilizing the economy after a heavy COVID-affected year. In terms of personal change and key legislation, the personnel apparatus, I will give a little bit a guesstimate of who we expect to be in the top positions there in a bit. Of course, always interesting, the announcement of a GDP target. We expect it to be at least around 5%. The fiscal deficit, in the budget plan that is also being discussed, and the military spending, which probably is rising again to somewhere above 7%. This year, again, special because it's the between 5-year cycles. already announced have been institutional restructuring in the party and state. And there are signals that this is going to be pretty significant. This is normal every 5 years, but as we know, Xi Jinping, he's only doing big things. So I actually expect quite a bit of surprises and institutional restructuring in terms of how the party works, governs the state, and probably also in the state apparatus in terms of ministries and so on. But a little bit more in a bit. One law has been announced as being amended, the legislation law. This is important. It guides how the country, how China makes laws, who is in charge of adopting the laws. So this is quite an important piece of legislation, and we're looking forward to see how it exactly comes out. The theme, of course, and Jacob will talk a bit more to the economy here, is of course that now reestablishing confidence is really key. Growth has to be kickstarted after a very difficult year with zero COVID and the departure from zero COVID. More party commissions are probably in the mix. You probably remember 2018, the last round of massive restructurings where a lot of party commissions were institutionalized as really the top level of decision making and planning for policy making. So really deepening the integration of the state administration under party leadership is something I expect. It already actually was announced a few days ago. Another area, or the areas where I expect restructuring to also happen a little bit more focused is finance and also in the security and defense sector. In technology, Xi Jinping just came out a few days ago and talked about the technology and innovation sector. But also, and this is not so much discussed, maybe this is my wish list more than actually reading the science, is that in energy policy and decarbonization, the competencies that ministries have are pretty mixed still. They are not aligned very well, and I hope and expect that there's going to be some kind of restructuring on who's dealing with decarbonization, climate policy, and so on. Something to watch, and again, I will talk a bit about the individual reports that we have to watch out for. Are the socio-economic policy shifts or signals really? Labor, unemployment issues. So the socio-economic issues that really are pressing this year, they will receive important signals also during the NPC. So one case in point, the financial sector, which everyone expects to be targeted with restructuring. The financial sector, or the financial risk compound, is one of the three big risks that Xi Jinping outlined already a few years ago. It's still probably next to poverty alleviation and pollution, is one of the three big risks that yet has to be cleared. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the financial sector. There has been a lot of signaling in the past days and weeks that anti-corruption efforts, cleaning up the financial sector and so on will continue. One of the key financiers, Bao Fan, in the finance sector was arrested and disappeared for a week. Now he's been set to aid the authorities in investigation. So it's pretty clear that something is coming in the financial sector. And a lot of rumors have been floated about reestablishing of kind of an old financial work commission. This is an organ that was established in 2 decades ago to mainly deal with the financial crisis in Asia. So a lot of stuff happening, or possibly happening in the finance sector. And also here, new leaders, for example, the governor and the party secretary. These are 2 different positions in the People's Bank of China, which is really one of the most important financial institutions in China, are still open. Also, the Ministry of Finance could receive a new minister. So in a way, open for more professional governance, but also, of course, open for Xi Jinping to place his favorite guys in these important institutions. Now we can please go back to the former 2 slides. So this is just an overview of some of the state posts that are to be elected and announced. The names that you can see is of the people that we expect. Some of them are already more or less clear. For example, Ying Yong, he has already been announced. Wang Huning, all but clear to be the chairman of the CPPCC, for example. But the others, the state councillors, the vice premiers, and so on, they're also pretty important in dealing with the daily supervision of state organs. And I don't have to tell you this, but of course, these people are all high-ranking party officials, so they all already sit, most of them at least, in ministerial or even more higher-ranking positions, Politburo and so on, of the party. So this is why I'm talking about the finalization of the leadership reshuffle of party and state. The next slide, please. The important documents that we'll watch out for are the following here. On the 5th, so on Sunday, the Premier will start with delivering the annual government work report. This is quite an important document, signal major policy, and also talk about what the party did well or what the government did well the past year, really kind of stamping out the main signals for the next year. Also important and sometimes a bit overwatched is the plan for national economic and social development. This is the development plan drafted by the National Development and Reform Commission. So it's a bit more detailed in terms of socio-economic planning and targets, regional development, for example, education and so on. Central and local budget plans, of course, interesting for people who crunch the numbers. The defense spending will be announced. But there's also some reports that are a little bit more specialized. The Supreme Court, the People's Procuratorate, so the legal branches that will put out their work report. The National People's Congress Standing Committee will report on its work on legal affairs, on legislation, and so on. And two pieces of legislation: the China legislative law I talked about before, and then of course the probably most interesting part for party nerds, the Party and State Institutional Reform Program, which will line out what exactly is meant by the institutional restructuring that we are in for. I'm happy to talk a little bit more in detail about what I will expect to be the restructurings, but we can probably take that after Jacob goes through the economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Nis. Yeah, so before I get into what sort of changes I'd expected in terms of economic policy making at the NPC, first I want to kind of zoom back out and sort of review how is Xi Jinping's economic agenda going. And obviously I can't cover every single aspect of the economic agenda, but a couple of key highlights. First is that we've seen in 2022 in particular throughout the year and has continued through 2023, that economic headwinds are really starting to restrain Xi Jinping and sort of the core leadership's options that are available to them. And this stands in comparison to sort of the pandemic, the first 2 years of the pandemic, where the kind of relative success of the lockdowns and the zero COVID policy compared to the rest of the world really gave a lot of political space to Xi Jinping to pursue more sort of politically motivated strategic goals at the expense of economic growth. Sort of that additional legitimacy gained by being much better than the rest of the world gave him that space. And this facilitated a lot of the sort of crackdown on everything that we saw throughout the first couple of years of the pandemic. But what we can see is that there's been a really significant shift in 2022, and it's starting to hit the sort of the economic baseline for the party state, which in particular is employment. In this case, youth unemployment, as you can see in this chart here, has pretty steadily climbed up throughout the entirety of the pandemic. So what we're starting to see is a little bit of a backing off of some of those political goals. We shouldn't interpret that as an abandoning of the political goals, as I'll get into later, but sort of slowing down, softening tones, and trying to sort of get the economy moving back in the right direction in a post-zero COVID sort of recovery period. The next slide, please. Importantly, though, some of Xi Jinping's other sort of broader strategic goals have continued to make progress throughout even 2022. So here we can see this on this chart, sort of total private investment, and then breaking that investment down into construction, manufacturing, and tertiary investments. And very importantly, we have the big recovery that happens sort of in 2021, and especially in construction. And then we see the real estate crackdown really coming down hard and affecting that growth year over year, and that it sort of remains suppressed throughout 2022. And we see a similar sort of story, not as big of swings, of course, but we see that tertiary investment remains kind of low and suppressed, but manufacturing investment remains quite high and continue to grow throughout even 2022. And what that shows is that investors really have been responding to the increasingly political incentive structure that Xi Jinping and the top leadership have put forward. So that investment in manufacturing is going into like industrial upgrading and fits in more broadly with the technological self-reliance and climbing up the value chain goals that the party state have sort of imposed on the economy. So in that sense, there has still been progress even throughout the difficulties of 2022. Next slide, please. Now, we also have this idea of dual circulation that Xi Jinping has sort of put at the core of his economic agenda. The idea being that it's time for China to become less reliant on export-driven growth and development and become more reliant on consumption-driven growth. And here, Xi Jinping hasn't been as successful as he may have hoped for. As you can see on the chart, relative to a lot of other economies, China's household consumption is still relatively quite low. And very importantly, since the 19th Party Congress, we haven't really seen very much progress in terms of boosting up consumption. And really what that shows is that, not only during the pandemic were there the difficulties of getting people to go out and consume because of the uncertainty they faced, but also there are certain inherent contradictions in Xi Jinping's goal of promoting dual circulation and a consumption-driven side of the economy on one side of the equation, and this obsession with sort of securitization of the economy and technological self-reliance and aggressive industrial policy to become less reliant on the West for technology. And that inherent contradiction doesn't seem to be moving very, very clearly in any direction that would be positive for boosting consumption. And the simple reality is that if you want technological self-reliance, you need capital to flow to those strategic industries to promote that. And that means less is available for households. And households and consumers they don't make decisions based on the strategic technology goals of Beijing. They don't care if where a semiconductor comes from. They don't care about whether the polymers that go into their laptop or their cell phone or their car are coming from a German chemical company or a Chinese chemical company. So hence the investment, kind of has to be made by the state and by state-owned enterprises and by private companies that are pushed into that incentive structure that I covered on that last slide. So dual circulation doesn't seem to be progressing. In fact, exports hit a peak in 2022. So in that sense, this part of Xi's economic agenda has not made progress. Next slide, please. So sort of looking at what I'm going to be looking for and what I might expect at the NPC, but focus a bit more on the economy. First are the personnel and institutional changes, fully in line with Nis on the new economic leadership, the new premier and czar, kind of economic czar, replacing Li Keqiang and Liu He. Though importantly, neither Li Qiang or He Lifeng, who we expect to be replacing Liu He, neither of them really quite stand up in comparison to their predecessors in terms of experience and success, but also in terms of, and you see this across a lot of the economic and financial leadership roster of the people that seem most likely to get there. There's a profound lack of international experience. These are all sort of insider party and kind of China-focused people. And that's going to make it really difficult, I think, for economic management in conjunction with the rest of the world. And importantly, as far as institutional changes, we actually have a little bit of a debate going here in MERICS between different experts about just how significant they'll be. Obviously, the readout from the second plenum over the last couple of days has suggested this is going to be quite extensive. So irrespective of just how big or small those changes will be, it's important to note that if there are too many major institutional changes, it will seriously undermine confidence, and it'll really undermine the ability for officials to actually do their jobs. I was there in Beijing working at the European Chamber of Commerce during the last reshuffle, and for the better part of a year, it was really difficult. And if you were dealing with any of the ministries that had seen major changes, it was really difficult to know who to work with and who to reach out to, and to actually be able to like facilitate business and normal interaction with the government. So this is a really critical year for recovery, and you know, the more that they push those major institutional changes, the harder it'll be for officials to actually, you know, get down on the ground and do their job. Otherwise, I would broadly expect a return to normality, really solidifying, as Nis said, the end of zero COVID, trying to get things back on track. Also, I would expect some signals of sort of softening on some of the crackdowns. The real estate crackdown in particular, I would expect to see a lot more softening of language around that, because that is a really important kind of core driver of growth, and also, frankly, of local tax revenue. And you know, they didn't really succeed in a lot of the goals that they had set out for the real estate sort of crackdown or rectification, but they need to get that engine running again. The big tech crackdown, or you know, I prefer the term rectification. We'll also see more softening of language on that. We've already seen that in the last few months, but that's not because they failed and that they need to, you know, backtrack on policy. That's rather that Beijing kind of got everything that it wanted out of that crackdown, and now that they've got these companies in line with the strategic goals and in line with data and cybersecurity rules and such, now it's time for them to, you know, get the economy humming again. And then lastly, in terms of some of the strategic goals that I expect will really remain in place, obviously all things kind of national security related, which covers a lot under Xi Jinping's understanding of national security. Those will continue to progress. So military modernization, and I mean that specifically in terms of budget outlays. That's, you know, these have grown year over year very consistently, and I expect that they'll continue to grow. And that means fewer resources to try to drive growth or try to drive development in other places. At a time where government purses are relatively strained. And also the tech self-reliance campaign, this will continue to progress as well. This is central to Xi Jinping's, not only his domestic goals, but also the geopolitical rivalry with the United States. And otherwise, though, I expect kind of softer tones in the broader sense about being kind of more pro-business, less ideological, to try to boost investor and consumer confidence. And importantly, they don't need to be very ideological in the NPC this year. They have the option, Xi Jinping and his kind of core leadership group, they can always come back at the end of the year with a much more ideological policymaking signals coming out of the third plenum, which should be probably November, December of this year. And that'll really set the stage for the economic policymaking and sort of the core ideology of economic policymaking for the next 5 years. So ideology might be able to make a comeback, but I would expect this year they're going to, here at the NPC, they'll kind of soften their tones. And with that, I'll pass it back to Claudia.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Nis, for your inputs. So we are looking at a very interesting event. It's a critical year for China. You just said it, Jacob, for economic recovery, huge institutional changes ahead, and that needs to be balanced out if you want to make sure that party cadres and whoever is involved do not only focus on institutional changes, but get the work done to get economic recovery on track.